till death do us part. Jason had spent weeks planning the perfect Valentine's Day for him and Emily. A secluded cabin deep in the woods, candlelit dinner, a bed covered in rose petals. It was supposed to be the kind of night they would always remember. He wanted to propose, to finally ask Emily to spend the rest of her life with him. The ring sat heavy in his pocket as they pulled up to the cabin, the snowfall blanketing the trees in an eerie silence. Emily squeezed his hand, smiling as she gazed at the cabin. "It's perfect," she whispered. Jason grinned, feeling a rush of excitement. He had no idea that by the end of the night, their love story would turn into a nightmare. Inside, the cabin was warm and intimate, the fireplace crackling softly as Jason set up the dinner. Emily hummed along to the soft music playing from her phone, pouring them both a glass of wine. Everything was going exactly as planned. They laughed, talked, and reminisced about the night they first met. Jason's nerves were electric as he reached into his pocket, feeling the velvet box between his fingers. Just as he was about to kneel, Emily suddenly winced, her hand going to her stomach. "I don't feel so good," she murmured. Her skin paled, and sweat beaded on her forehead. Jason frowned, his moment of excitement quickly turning to concern. "Maybe you drank too fast," he suggested, but Emily shook her head, her breathing growing uneven. Then she collapsed. Panic surged through Jason as he caught her before she hit the floor. Her body convulsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Emily, Emily, talk to me." His voice was shaking as he cradled her. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. "Shit," he muttered, his mind racing. He needed to get her to a hospital. Lifting her into his arms, he stumbled toward the door. But as soon as he reached for the handle, the cabin lights flickered and went out. A strange sound, like the creaking of wood under immense pressure, filled the air. Then a whisper low, distant, and chilling. Jason's breath hitched as he turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" His voice cracked with fear. The fire in the hearth flickered violently before extinguishing completely, plunging the room into an oppressive cold. Emily's body twitched in his arms, her lips parting as if to speak. But the voice that came from her wasn't hers. "You brought her here," it rasped. "Now she belongs to me." Jason stumbled back, nearly dropping Emily. Her eyes, once a beautiful shade of green, had turned black as ink. A cruel smile twisted her lips, her fingers digging into his arms with inhuman strength. Jason screamed as he felt his skin burn where she touched him, a cold fire searing into his flesh. The shadows in the cabin thickened, taking shape, twisting around them like grasping hands. The air reeked of rot. Jason's mind reeled. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He tried to pull away, but Emily or whatever had taken hold of her, clawed at his chest, dragging him closer. "You love her?" the thing inside Emily whispered mockingly. "Then die with her." A sharp pain tore through Jason's abdomen. He looked down, his breath catching in his throat. Emily's hand was buried in his stomach, her nails impossibly long, curved like talons, dripping with his blood. He gasped, his vision going white-hot with agony as she twisted deeper. "Emily," he choked, reaching for her face. For a brief moment, he saw her, his Emily, her eyes wide with terror, her lips mouthing a silent plea. Run. But it was too late. Jason collapsed to the floor, the warmth of his blood pooling around him. His limbs went numb as the shadow swallowed Emily whole, her scream fading into the void. Be mine forever. Sophie had always wanted a perfect Valentine's Day. Candles, roses, a romantic dinner, all the things she never got in her past relationships. But this year was different. This year, she had Ethan. Sweet, attentive, perfect Ethan. He had planned a surprise for her, refusing to tell her any details except that she should dress nice. She arrived at his apartment that evening, excitement bubbling in her chest. The hallway was lined with red roses, leading to his door, which was already ajar. A candle-lit glow flickered from inside. Sophie stepped in, smiling. Ethan? The scent of something rich and metallic filled the air, something that didn't quite match the roses. Then she saw the table. A candle-lit dinner, just as she imagined. A heart-shaped cake, a bottle of wine, and a large raw slab of meat sitting on an ornate plate. The deep red flesh gleamed in the candlelight. Ethan stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're early," he said, smiling wide. "I was just finishing up." Sophie's stomach twisted. What? What is that?" Ethan chuckled, pulling out her chair. "Dinner, of course." Sophie didn't sit. She stared at the meat, her pulse pounding in her ears. Something was wrong. The texture, the shape. It wasn't steak. It wasn't any cut of meat she recognized. I'm not hungry," she stammered. "Maybe we can just have some wine." Ethan's smile faltered, his gaze darkening. "I made this just for you, Sophie." She took a step back. "Ethan, what kind of meat is that?" Silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver. A necklace. A necklace she recognized. It was her ex-boyfriend's, the one who had ghosted her 6 months ago, vanishing without a trace. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Where did you get that?" Ethan tilted his head. "He didn't deserve you, Sophie." Her knees nearly buckled. The room was spinning, the scent of raw meat making her gag. Ethan stepped closer, running his fingers through her hair. "But I do. I'll always take care of you." Sophie turned to run, but Ethan was faster. His arms wrapped around her, tight as a vice, his breath hot against her ear. "You don't have to be scared," he whispered. "I saved his heart for you." Her scream was cut off by the sharp prick of a needle. The last thing she saw before the world faded to black was Ethan's loving smile. "Happy Valentine's Day, my love." The Secret Admirer. Lena never had a secret admirer before, so when the first note appeared in her locker on February 1st, she felt flattered. The paper was a soft pink, folded neatly, with delicate cursive that read, "I've been watching you for so long. This year, you'll finally be mine." At first, she laughed it off, thinking it was a joke from one of her friends, but something about the wording unsettled her. Over the next few days, more notes appeared, on her car windshield, slipped under her apartment door, even inside her textbook. Each one was more intense, describing details about her daily routine, things only someone watching closely would know. "I love the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're nervous. I saw you in the cafe today, but you didn't see me." By Valentine's Day, Lena was thoroughly creeped out, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Her friends tried to reassure her, saying it was probably some shy guy who didn't know how to confess properly. That morning, a velvet box was waiting on her doorstep, tied with a satin ribbon. Inside was a locket, beautifully intricate, the kind of thing that belonged to another era. She turned it over in her palm, frowning as she saw something engraved on the back. "Forever yours." Her stomach twisted, a strange sense of familiarity washing over her as she clicked it open. Inside, there was a tiny faded photograph of a girl, no, not just any girl, her. The picture was old, though, yellowed at the edges, like it had been taken decades ago. But that didn't make sense. How could someone have a picture of her from a time before she was even born? Her phone buzzed, making her jump, and when she looked at the screen, her breath hitched. A new text message from an unknown number simply read, "Put it on." Hands shaking, she tossed the locket back into the box and slammed the lid shut. Her doorbell rang, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly she approached the peephole, her heart hammering. But when she looked through, no one was there. Just the empty hallway stretching in both directions. Another chime from her phone made her stomach drop. "I know you're home. Don't make me wait." A sudden draft whispered against her neck, and her body went rigid as she realized something horrifying. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut, and yet the locket she had just thrown away was now hanging around her neck. Blind date. Amy never liked blind dates, but her friends insisted this one would be different. They told her Mark was handsome, charming, and exactly what she needed to shake off her breakup. To her surprise, they were right. Mark was polite, funny, and made her feel like the only person in the room. As their Valentine's dinner stretched on, she found herself actually enjoying the night. When it was time to leave, he insisted on walking her home, saying, "It's late, and I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you." Amy didn't argue, letting him guide her through the snowy streets. They walked in comfortable silence until she turned down an alley shortcut she always took. As soon as they were deep enough, Mark's grip on her wrist tightened, his nails pressing into her skin. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said, his voice low, almost disappointed. Amy's pulse quickened, a cold dread curling in her gut. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, trying to pull away, but his hold only grew stronger. He chuckled, a humorless sound that made her stomach twist. "No," he whispered, leaning in close. "I never forget a face, especially not yours." Amy's breath hitched as she stared at him, her mind racing. Who was he? Where had they met? Mark reached into his coat pocket, his smile widening. "You broke my heart once," he said softly. "Now, I'm going to break yours." Amy yanked her arm free and bolted, the cold air stinging her lungs as she ran. She didn't stop until she reached a crowded street, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. When she finally turned back, Mark was gone, vanished into the darkness. For a moment she thought maybe she had imagined it, the entire encounter some twisted nightmare. Then she saw the small red box sitting on her doorstep. When she got home, her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, nausea rising in her throat. Inside was a human heart, still warm, its deep red color glistening under the porch light. A note was tucked beside it, the handwriting eerily neat. "You should have remembered me." Amy dropped the box and stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. She wasn't sure which was worse, that Mark had found her, or that she had no idea when he would come back. The imposter. Sarah was running late for her Valentine's date, rushing through her apartment as she pulled on her coat. Ben had texted her an hour ago, saying he was on his way to pick her up, but he still hadn't arrived. It wasn't like him to be late. He was the kind of guy who showed up early, flowers in hand, just to see her smile. As she checked her phone again, headlights flashed through her window, and relief washed over her. She grabbed her purse, not even bothering to double-check the message that had just come through. "Can't wait to see you." She locked the door behind her and hurried to the waiting car, sliding into the passenger seat. "Finally," she sighed, glancing over at Ben with a playful pout. He smiled, that familiar dimple in his left cheek appearing just like always. "Sorry, babe," he murmured. Traffic was a nightmare. She relaxed into the seat, reaching for his hand, but something about his grip felt off too tight, too cold. His skin had a faint smell of metal, like old pennies, but she ignored it, convincing herself she was imagining things. As they drove, Sarah noticed he was quieter than usual. Normally, Ben filled the car with stories about his day, dumb jokes or sweet compliments that made her roll her eyes. But tonight, he barely spoke, his hands gripping the wheel a little too hard. "You okay?" she asked, studying his profile in the dim light. He turned to her with that same dimpled smile. "Yeah," he said, "just been a long day." His voice was almost perfect, almost, but there was a hesitation, a stiffness that made something in her stomach twist. The restaurant was only 10 minutes away, but when they missed the turn, Sarah frowned. "You passed it," she said, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Ben didn't slow down. "Thought we could take a detour," he said casually. "Spend some time alone first." The way he said it made her shiver. "Ben," she pressed, her voice a little sharper now. "Where are we going?" He exhaled through his nose, fingers flexing on the wheel. "Somewhere quiet," he murmured. "Somewhere no one will bother us." Her heart picked up speed, and she subtly reached for her phone, trying to keep her movements casual. But before she could unlock it, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a bruising force. "No distractions," he said softly, taking the phone and slipping it into his pocket. "Let's just enjoy tonight." Fear crept into her bones as she stared at him, really stared. His eyes were the same shade of brown, his face the same shape. But there was something missing, something hollow in the way he moved, the way he smiled. She forced a laugh, trying to play along. "Okay," she said, keeping her voice light. "But you're acting really weird." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I'm just excited," he said. "I've been waiting for this for a long, long time." As the road stretched into darkness, Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She didn't know how or why, but deep in her gut, she knew one terrifying truth. The man sitting next to her wasn't Ben. His and hers, Lily's boyfriend, Ethan, was obsessed with making Valentine's Day perfect for her. Every year he planned something extravagant, roses, chocolates, candlelit dinners. This year was no different. He had texted her that morning and telling her to meet him at his cabin deep in the woods for a special surprise. The drive was long, the snow thick on the roads, but she smiled, imagining him waiting with a bouquet in hand. She had no idea it would be the last time she ever saw anything outside those woods. When she arrived, the cabin was dark, the only light coming from a fire flickering inside. The door was unlocked, and when she stepped in, a chill ran through her. Candles lined the floor in the shape of a heart. A dinner table was set for two, but Ethan was nowhere to be seen. "Ethan," she called, stepping forward. The floor creaked beneath her boots, and for the first time, she noticed the scent in the air, something metallic beneath the smoke. Then she saw it. The walls weren't decorated with pictures like she remembered. Instead, they were covered in Polaroids, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. Each one was of her, pictures she never remembered being taken. Some were of her at work, some at home, some through her bedroom window. Her stomach twisted as she stepped closer, her breath hitching when she saw the last row of photos. They were from tonight, one of her getting out of her car, one of her stepping onto the porch, one of her reaching for the doorknob. She whirled around, panic surging in her chest, and that's when she saw him standing in the doorway. "You weren't supposed to see those yet," Ethan said softly, tilting his head. He stepped forward, shutting the door behind him. Lily took a step back, her legs trembling. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was going to show you after dinner," he murmured, almost disappointed. "You always talk about wanting a love that lasts forever. I made sure of it." Lily's breath came in short gasps, as she noticed the knife in his hand, the firelight gleaming off the blade. She turned to run, but he was faster, grabbing her wrist and yanking her close. "Don't be scared," he whispered against her ear. "You'll always be mine." Her scream was lost in the crackling fire as the cabin swallowed her whole. That night, another Polaroid joined the wall-one final picture of Lily, frozen in time, forever his. The catfish. Ben had spent the last few weeks talking to Saphira online. Her profile picture was of a striking woman with long black hair and deep, dark eyes that seemed to call out to him. She described herself as an artist, someone passionate about creating and traveling to the most beautiful, hidden places. Their conversations began casually, but soon grew deeper. Ben confided in her about his past, his struggles, his loneliness, and his dreams of finding someone who truly understood him. Saphira, always compassionate and attentive, made him feel like he wasn't alone anymore. It felt like fate when they decided to meet in person on Valentine's Day. The idea of meeting her filled Ben with excitement. Saphira had promised him a special weekend, away at a secluded cabin, far from the distractions of the city. "It will be perfect," she had written. "A place where we can finally be ourselves." They had agreed to meet at the cabin that night. The excitement Ben felt was unlike anything he had experienced in a long time, and he couldn't wait to make their connection real. But when he arrived at the cabin, something felt off. The place was surrounded by dense woods, and the snow-covered ground was eerily quiet. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Ben's unease grew as the minutes passed. He sent a text to Saphira, but it went unread. He tried calling, but there was no response. The cold air made his breath cloud, and an ominous silence pressed in on him. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, the faint sound of creaking from inside the cabin made him hesitate. His curiosity got the better of him, and he pushed the door open. It was unlocked. The inside of the cabin was dim, with only the light of a flickering fireplace casting shadows across the room. Ben stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the space. It felt abandoned, but there was a lingering smell, something metallic, sharp, and unpleasant. Then he noticed the overturned chair and a wineglass on the floor, its contents spilled. His heart began to race. "Saphira?" he called out, but there was no answer. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. He stepped further into the cabin, his footsteps echoing. As he walked deeper, a strange chill settled over him, and he instinctively reached for his phone again, only to find it had no signal. Panic began to settle in, and his mind raced. Had something happened to her? His thoughts were interrupted when he heard it. A low, sinister laugh from behind him. Ben spun around to find a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, his broad figure looming in the shadows. He wore a baseball cap that obscured most of his face, but the gleam of a long knife in his hand was unmistakable. The man took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Ben's. Ben's stomach dropped, and his pulse quickened. "Who are you?" Ben demanded, backing away. The man chuckled again, the sound dark and cold. "I'm the one who's been talking to you, Ben," he said, his voice unsettling. "But I'm not Saphira. I've been playing you." Ben's heart raced as he turned to run, but the man moved faster than he anticipated. He grabbed Ben by the arm and spun him around, slamming him into the wall. Ben fought back, throwing punches, his desperation rising. "Get off me," he shouted, but the man didn't flinch. Ben kicked out, connecting with the man's knee, but it barely slowed him down. The man's grip tightened, and before Ben could react, the man pulled out a syringe from his jacket pocket. "Time to sleep," he whispered. Ben tried to break free, but the man held him down, the needle plunging into his neck before he could do anything. The cold, Burning sensations spread through his veins as his vision blurred. His limbs grew heavy, and his movements became sluggish. "No," Ben muttered, struggling to stay conscious, but the world around him began to spin. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the man's twisted grin. When Ben woke up, his head was pounding, and his entire body felt like lead. He tried to move but found himself unable to. His limbs were bound, his mouth gagged. Panic surged through him as he realized he was inside a barrel. The cold metal was crushing, and he could feel the pressure around him. His breath was shallow, his heart thudding in his chest. The man's voice echoed in his mind. "I'll send Saphira a nice message from you," the man had said. The thought of it made Ben's stomach churn. He struggled to move, to scream, but it was no use. He could barely feel his body now. The man had played him, lured him in with the promise of love, only to trap him for his twisted pleasure. And now, Ben realized, with a final horrifying clarity, that he was nothing more than the next victim in a long line of people who had trusted the wrong person online. As the cold seeped deeper into his bones, Ben's consciousness began to fade. He couldn't escape. He wouldn't escape. The Heart Collector? Valentine's Day had always been a busy night for Detective Harris. Every year, like clockwork, another couple was found slaughtered in their home, their hearts removed with surgical precision. The media called the killer the Heart Collector. Harris called him a nightmare. This year, the killings had started early. A young couple was found in their apartment, their bodies sprawled across a candlelit dinner table, their chests carved open. The words "Be mine" were scrawled in blood across the wall. The case had gone cold. No leads, no witnesses, until a terrified woman named Lily called the station. "I think someone's watching me," she whispered into the phone. "Everywhere I go, I feel it, and I've been getting these gifts." "Gifts?" Harris asked. Lily hesitated. "Boxes, wrapped in red paper. Inside are hearts." Harris's blood ran cold. "Stay where you are. We're coming." He arrived at her apartment 20 minutes later. The place was dark, the front door slightly ajar. Gun drawn, he stepped inside. "Lily?" No response. He moved cautiously through the apartment, past the untouched Valentine's chocolates on the counter, past the roses wilting in a vase. Then he saw it. A small, neatly wrapped box sat on the kitchen table. He reached for it, hand shaking. Inside was a human heart, fresh and glistening. Then he heard it, ragged breathing behind him. Harris spun around just as something sharp plunged into his stomach. Lily stood before him, her hands slick with blood, her eyes shining with something close to love. "You found my gift,"